Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's most misunderstood and deliberately hidden aspects of Viking society, the complex world of women, who sold their bodies not just for survival, but as part of an intricate social and religious system that would make modern escort services look primitive by comparison. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Viking prostitutes. Most people imagine either helpless slave women forced into sexual servitude, or perhaps bawdy tavern wenches straight out of a Hollywood movie. In reality, the world of Viking-era sex work was a sophisticated network that included everything from temple priestesses, performing sacred fertility rites, to independent businesswomen who operated their own establishments and wielded considerable social influence. Think of it less like modern street prostitution and more like a combination of religious ceremony, social networking, and economic enterprise. This wasn't some crude medieval version of a red light district. It was an integral part of Norse society that connected commerce, spirituality, politics, and survival in ways that would persist for centuries. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, wasn't the testosterone-fueled warrior fantasy that modern media portrays. Scandinavia during this period was a complex web of competing kingdoms, trading networks, and social structures where women held far more power and autonomy than their counterparts in Christian Europe. Norse society wasn't some primitive barbarian culture. It was a sophisticated civilization with intricate laws, extensive trade routes stretching from Greenland to Constantinople, and social customs that would seem surprisingly modern in some ways and utterly alien in others. The concept of seer, Norse magic primarily practiced by women, gave female practitioners significant social status and influence. If you thought Viking women spent their days quietly weaving while men went raiding, think again. They were merchants, landowners, religious leaders, and yes, professional sex workers who operated within accepted social frameworks. The famous Arabic chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Vikings along the Volga River in 922 CE, wrote detailed accounts of their customs that included explicit descriptions of sexual practices and the women who facilitated them. These weren't marginalized outcasts, but integral members of communities who served multiple social functions beyond simple sexual gratification. Enter Ingrid the Wise, a semi-legendary figure mentioned in several Icelandic sagas who operated what can only be described as a high-end escort service for wealthy merchants and jarls in 10th century Norway. According to the saga of the people of Age of Fjormur, Ingrid wasn't just selling sex. She was selling access to information, political connections, and spiritual services. Her establishment near the port of Trondheim served as an informal embassy, where foreign traders could learn local customs, negotiate business deals, and participate in fertility rituals that were believed to bring good fortune to their ventures. But here's the twist. Ingrid was also a powerful vulva, a female shaman, who claimed to communicate with the gods. She used her position to gather intelligence about trade routes, political alliances, and military movements, making her one of the most well-informed individuals in the region. When King Olaf Tryggvason began his campaign to Christianize Norway, Ingrid's establishment became a center of resistance to the new religion, offering sanctuary to those who wished to practice the old ways. The saga describes how she maintained a network of women across multiple settlements, each trained not only in sexual arts but also in herbal medicine, divination, and what we might today call psychological counseling. And if you think that's fascinating, Wait until you hear about the religious ceremonies these women conducted that scandalized Christian missionaries for centuries. This wasn't just about sexual commerce, or even women's liberation in a medieval context. The world of Viking prostitutes represented a fundamental clash between different concepts: sexuality, spirituality, and social organization that would shape Northern European culture for generations. These women operated at the intersection of the sacred and profane, serving as priestesses, healers, confidantes, and political intermediaries in ways that challenged both contemporary Christian morality and modern assumptions about medieval women's roles. Their practices preserved ancient fertility cults and goddess worship that predated Christianity by thousands of years, while simultaneously adapting to the commercial realities of an increasingly connected world. The stakes were enormous: the survival of pre-Christian religious traditions, the economic independence of women in a rapidly changing society, and the preservation of social customs that provided crucial services in communities where formal institutions were often weak or non-existent. When Christian kings began their conversion campaigns, these women and their establishments became symbols of everything the new religion sought to eliminate, leading to conflicts that would echo through Scandinavian history for centuries. But Ingrid the Wise was just the beginning of a story that spans continents and centuries, involving everyone from Irish slave girls sold in the markets of Dublin to Slavic princesses who used sexual politics to forge international alliances. The web of Viking-era sex work stretched from the fjords of Norway to the rivers of Russia, connecting diverse cultures and economies in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The sacred and the sexual were inseparably intertwined in Norse culture in ways that would horrify medieval Christian observers and confuse modern audiences accustomed to thinking of prostitution as purely secular commerce. Unlike the Christian worldview that increasingly dominated Europe, where sexuality was viewed with suspicion and celibacy was considered holy, Norse religion celebrated fertility, sexual prowess, and the life-giving power of sexual union. The goddess Freya, one of the most important deities in the Norse pantheon, was simultaneously the patron of love, beauty, fertility, and death. And according to several sources, she was also closely associated with seer magic and what Christian writers would later condemn as sexual promiscuity. The Volvas, female shamans and seers who practiced seer, occupied a unique position in Norse society where sexual knowledge and spiritual power were considered complementary rather than contradictory. These women often served dual roles as religious practitioners and providers of sexual services, seeing no conflict between communing with the gods and engaging in sacred prostitution. This wasn't some primitive confusion between religion and sexuality. It represented a sophisticated theological system where sexual energy was understood as a form of divine power that could be channeled for healing, divination, and ensuring the fertility of crops, livestock, and communities. Take the fascinating case of the temple prostitutes at Uppsala, the great religious center of pre-Christian Sweden. According to Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler writing in the 11th century, the temple complex housed not only priests in sacred groves, but also women, who served the sexual needs of pilgrims and visitors as part of their religious duties. These weren't desperate women selling their bodies for survival. They were respected religious functionaries who underwent years of training in both sexual techniques and spiritual practices. The temple prostitutes learned to read omens from the patterns of their clients' breathing during climax, to prepare herbal contraceptives and aphrodisiacs, and to perform purification rituals that were believed to cleanse visitors of spiritual contamination from their travels. One particularly detailed account describes how these women would begin each encounter with prayers to Freya and end with divination rituals using specially consecrated runes. The sexual act itself was considered a form of prayer, a direct communion. with the fertility aspects of the divine that could bring good fortune, successful harvests, and protection from enemies. Foreign merchants would travel hundreds of miles specifically to participate in these rituals, believing that sexual union with a temple prostitute would ensure the success of their trading expeditions. But the services extended far beyond simple sexual gratification. These women served as counselors, healers, and intermediaries who could interpret dreams, cure sexual dysfunction, and provide advice on everything from marital problems to business ventures. The temple prostitutes maintained detailed knowledge of herbal medicine, particularly plants that could prevent or terminate pregnancy, cure sexually transmitted diseases, and enhance sexual performance. But it wasn't that simple, and the reality was far more complex than either Christian condemnation or modern romanticization would suggest. The line between voluntary religious service and sexual slavery was often blurred, particularly when it came to women captured in raids or purchased in slave markets. While some vulves and temple prostitutes clearly enjoyed high status and considerable autonomy, others were thralls, enslaved women who had no choice in their sexual servitude, regardless of how it might be dressed up in religious language. The archaeological evidence from sites like Hidibi and Burqa reveals a more complicated picture where free women, freed slaves, and current slaves all participated in various forms of sex work, but with vastly different levels of agency and social status. Some sagas describe respected vulvas who owned their own land and commanded high fees for their services, while others mention slave women forced to service multiple men during religious festivals. The contradiction extended to the religious realm as well. While Freya was celebrated as a powerful goddess, the myths also describe her as promiscuous and manipulative, reflecting ambivalent attitudes toward female sexuality that persisted throughout Norse culture. Even the practice of seer magic carried contradictory associations. It was simultaneously revered as powerful and necessary, yet also considered somewhat shameful and unmanly when practiced by men, suggesting complex gender dynamics that we're still trying to understand. The result was a complex ecosystem of sexual commerce that adapted to local conditions, economic pressures, and cultural changes across the Viking world. In Iceland, where the population was small and largely Christian by the 11th century, temple prostitution disappeared relatively quickly, but informal sex work continued among women who maintained knowledge of the old fertility rituals. In more conservative areas like Denmark, the practice persisted longer but became increasingly underground as Christian influence grew. The consequences weren't limited to religious changes. The economic impact was substantial, as temple prostitution had generated significant revenue for religious centers and provided employment for hundreds of women across Scandinavia. When Christian kings began shutting down pagan temples, many former temple prostitutes were forced into less prestigious and more dangerous forms of sex work, or had to find entirely different means of survival. Some adapted by becoming herbalists or midwives, roles that allowed them to continue using their knowledge of sexual health and reproductive medicine. Others moved to trading centers where their services remained in demand, among merchants and travelers who cared less about religious orthodoxy than practical needs. The most enterprising established their own independent operations, often disguised as taverns or boarding houses that offered additional services to selected clients. The social reactions varied dramatically. While Christian clergy uniformly condemned these practices, many ordinary people continued to seek out these women's services, creating a thriving black market that would persist for centuries after the official conversion to Christianity. The spiritual dimensions of Viking prostitution extended far beyond simple temple services, encompassing elaborate seasonal festivals, initiation rituals, and healing ceremonies that integrated sexual practices with the deepest mysteries of Norse cosmology. The most significant of these was the annual Disablat, a fertility festival dedicated to the female spirits known as Desir, where temple prostitutes played central roles in ceremonies designed to ensure the fertility of crops, livestock, and human communities. These weren't crude orgies, but sophisticated religious dramas that could last for weeks, involving processions, sacrificial offerings, ritual purifications, and carefully choreographed sexual encounters that were believed to channel divine energy into the physical world. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gamla Uppsala reveals the extraordinary complexity of these ceremonies. Excavations have uncovered specialized buildings that appear to have been designed specifically for ritual sexual activities, featuring raised platforms, drainage systems for ritual washing, and elaborate decorations depicting fertility symbols and divine sexual encounters. The most remarkable discovery was a series of bronze plaques found in 1982 that appeared to illustrate different stages of sexual initiation rituals, showing how novice temple prostitutes were trained not just in physical techniques, but in the spiritual significance of their practices. These images reveal that temple prostitutes underwent years of preparation that included learning to read omens from sexual positions, mastering breathing techniques that induce trance states, and developing the ability to channel specific divine energies through carefully controlled sexual encounters. The role of vulvas in these ceremonies was particularly complex, as they served simultaneously as spiritual directors, medical practitioners, and sexual instructors. Contemporary sources describe how experienced vulvas would guide younger women through elaborate purification rituals before their first sexual encounters, using combinations of herbal baths, fasting, meditation, and sexual instruction to prepare them for what was considered a form of divine possession. The process could take months and involve learning to identify different types of spiritual energy, understand the sexual preferences of various gods and spirits, and develop the psychological resilience necessary to maintain spiritual focus during intense physical experiences. Perhaps most fascinating were the healing ceremonies that combined sexual practices with medical treatment, based on Norse beliefs about the connection between sexual energy and physical health. Temple prostitutes were trained in sophisticated diagnostic techniques that involved assessing clients' sexual responses to identify illnesses, psychological problems, and spiritual imbalances. Treatment often involved prescribed sexual activities, designed to restore harmony between different aspects of the person's being: physical, emotional, and spiritual. Some sources describe specialized treatments for battle trauma that would today be recognized as early forms of sexual therapy for post-traumatic stress, while others detail fertility treatments that combine sexual rituals with herbal medicine and dietary modifications. The international connections of these religious practices reveal how Viking spiritual sexuality influenced and was influenced by contact with other cultures. Archaeological evidence suggests that Norse temple prostitutes learned techniques from Celtic druids, Slavic shamans, and even Byzantine mystics, creating syncretic practices that blended elements from multiple spiritual traditions. The famous account by Ahmad ibn Fadlan includes descriptions of sexual rituals that combine Norse traditions with Islamic mystical practices, suggesting a remarkable degree of religious experimentation and cultural exchange. Some sources even hint at connections with tantric practices from India, transmitted through Byzantine and Arabic intermediaries who were fascinated by the Norse integration of sexuality and spirituality. The preservation of this knowledge through oral traditions maintained by vulvas created what amounted to ancient universities of sexual and spiritual learning, where information was passed down through generations of practitioners who guarded their secrets jealously while adapting them to changing circumstances. These knowledge networks connected isolated communities across vast distances, allowing innovations developed in Iceland to influence practices in Kiev. or techniques perfected in Ireland to reach settlements in Greenland. The complexity of this intellectual exchange challenges modern assumptions about medieval communications and reveals how specialized knowledge could spread rapidly across the Viking world through informal networks that operated independently of political and commercial relationships. Meanwhile, as the religious landscape shifted and old certainties crumbled, an entirely different aspect of Viking sex work was flourishing in the great trading centers and slave markets that connected Scandinavia to the wider world. Here, commerce rather than religion drove the industry, and the women involved faced entirely different challenges and opportunities that would reshape our understanding of medieval economic networks and cultural exchange. If the sacred prostitution of the temples was about spiritual power and divine fertility, then the commercial sex trade of the Viking trading centers was about cold, hard economics and international networks that spanned continents. The great markets of Hedeby, Burka, Novgorod, and Dublin weren't just places where amber, furs, and silver changed hands. They were sophisticated hubs of human trafficking, where women from dozens of different cultures were bought, sold, and trained for sexual service in a business that generated enormous profits for Viking entrepreneurs. This commercial dimension operated according to entirely different rules than temple prostitution, driven by supply and demand, quality control, and market competition rather than religious tradition or spiritual calling. The scale was staggering. Archaeological evidence suggests that thousands of women passed through these markets annually, representing one of the largest organized sex trafficking operations in medieval Europe. But unlike the religious prostitution that was primarily local and culturally specific, the commercial trade was aggressively international, adapting to different cultural preferences and creating standardized services that could appeal to merchants. From Ireland to Constantinople, consider the extraordinary case of Astrid the Trader, whose story emerges from multiple sources, including the Rus Primary Chronicle and several Arabic accounts from the 10th century. Astrid wasn't a prostitute herself, but rather a Viking woman who built a commercial empire based on the sex trade, operating what essentially amounted to a medieval multinational corporation with branches in multiple cities. Starting with a single establishment in Hedeby around 950 CE, she gradually expanded to control networks of brothels and escort services across the Baltic and down the Russian river routes. Her business model was revolutionary for its time. Instead of simply buying and selling women like livestock, she invested in training programs that taught languages, musical instruments, dancing, and even basic literacy to her workers. The Arabic chronicler Ibn Rusta describes visiting one of her establishments in Novgorod and being amazed at finding Irish women who could speak Arabic, Slavic girls who performed Norse ballads, and Byzantine refugees who had been trained in exotic sexual techniques from across the known world. Astrid's operation included recruitment networks that extended from Iceland to the Black Sea, transportation systems that moved women safely between cities, and even primitive forms of quality control and customer satisfaction guarantees. She employed former prostitutes as madams and trainers, created standardized pricing structures, and maintained detailed records of her inventory and profits that would have impressed modern corporate accountants. But perhaps most remarkably, she also operated what can only be described as an early retirement program, helping successful prostitutes establish their own businesses or arrange marriages with wealthy clients. When she died around 980, her estate included properties in 7 different cities, a private fleet of 12 ships, and enough liquid capital to ransom a king. The human stories behind these commercial operations were often heartbreaking. Take the case of Brigid, an Irish girl captured during a raid on a monastery in 943 and sold in the Dublin slave market to a Viking trader named Thorvald. Initially destined for domestic service, Bridget caught the attention of buyers because of her unusual red hair and pale skin, features that were highly prized in Byzantine markets. Instead of being shipped east immediately, she was purchased by one of Astrid's associates and sent to a training facility in Edibi, where she spent 2 years learning to speak Norse, Arabic, and Greek, mastering the sexual techniques preferred by different cultural groups and developing skills in music and storytelling that would make her more valuable to high-end clients. When she was finally sold to a merchant bound for Constantinople, Bridget commanded a price nearly 10 times higher than an untrained slave. But the story doesn't end there. Byzantine records suggest that she eventually gained her freedom, married a wealthy silk merchant, and used her linguistic skills and international connections to build her own trading business. Her case illustrates both the brutal exploitation inherent in the system and the occasional opportunities for social mobility that kept it functioning. This wasn't isolated to a few entrepreneurial individuals or specific locations. The commercialization of Viking sex work followed predictable patterns that repeated across the entire Norse world, driven by the same economic forces that shaped other aspects of medieval trade. The most successful operations were always located in major trading centers where international merchants congregated, offered services that catered to the specific cultural preferences of different customer bases, and invested heavily in the training and presentation of their workers. Quality control was crucial. Establishments that developed reputations for healthy, skilled, and attractive women could charge premium prices, while those that cut corners quickly lost market share to competitors. The geographical patterns were also consistent. Women were typically captured or recruited from peripheral areas and transported to cosmopolitan centers where their exotic origins increased their value. Irish and Anglo-Saxon women were particularly prized in Scandinavian markets, while Slavic women commanded high prices in Western European cities, and Nordic women were exotic luxuries in Byzantine and Arabic territories. The business model was essentially based on cultural arbitrage, exploiting differences in beauty standards, sexual preferences, and economic conditions between different regions to maximize profits. These patterns persisted for centuries and only began to break down when the rise of centralized kingdoms and Christian moral campaigns made large-scale sex trafficking more difficult and dangerous. The effects were profound and far-reaching, reshaping not only the lives of the women involved, but also the broader patterns of cultural exchange and economic development across medieval Europe. From an economic perspective, the commercial sex trade generated enormous wealth that funded further Viking expansion, and exploration profits from selling women in Constantinople helped finance expeditions to Greenland and North America, while revenue from Irish slave girls funded the establishment of permanent settlements in Iceland and the Faroes. The cultural impact was equally significant, as these women served as vectors for the transmission of languages, religious ideas, artistic styles, and technological innovations between distant regions. An Irish woman trained in a Edibi brothel might carry knowledge of Celtic metalworking techniques to a Byzantine client, while a Slavic prostitute working in Dublin could introduce Eastern European musical styles to Irish audiences. But the human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of women were torn from their families and cultures, forced into sexual slavery, and treated as commodities to be bought and sold. Even those who eventually gained freedom often found themselves culturally adrift, unable to return home, but never fully accepted in their new environments. The psychological trauma was immense and largely undocumented, as the voices of these women rarely survive in the historical record. The system also contributed to the broader militarization of Viking society, as slave raids became increasingly important for maintaining the supply of women needed to feed the commercial sex trade. The commercial dimension of Viking sex work operated according to sophisticated market principles that would have impressed modern economists, with complex pricing structures, quality differentiation, and international arbitrage opportunities that generated enormous profits for those skilled enough to navigate the system. The basic economics were driven by scarcity, cultural preferences, and geographic distance. A blonde Nordic woman could command premium prices in Constantinople, precisely because she was exotic and rare in Byzantine markets, while dark-haired Slavic women were highly valued in Scandinavian cities, where they represented forbidden pleasures from distant lands. But the real sophistication lay in the development of futures markets, insurance contracts, and credit arrangements that allowed operators to manage the enormous risks involved in transporting human cargo across thousands of miles of dangerous territory. The pricing structures that emerged revealed the mathematical precision with which Viking entrepreneurs approached their business. Detailed records preserved in runic inscriptions from Hedeby show that prices were calculated based on dozens of variables, including age, physical appearance, language skills, sexual experience, cultural background, and even astrological factors that different cultures considered important for determining compatibility. A young Irish woman with red hair, musical abilities, and knowledge of Latin could sell for 20 times the price of an older Slavic woman with no special skills. But the same Slavic woman might be worth twice as much in Dublin, where her exotic appearance would attract premium clients. The most valuable women were those who combined physical beauty with intellectual accomplishments, former nuns who could read and write, daughters of nobles who understood court etiquette, or skilled artisans who could teach their crafts while providing sexual services. Supply chain management in the Viking sex trade rivaled anything developed by medieval merchants dealing in conventional commodities, with specialized roles for recruiters, transporters, trainers, and marketers, who each added value to the final product. Professional recruiters operated in areas devastated by warfare or economic collapse, identifying women who possessed the physical and intellectual qualities that would command high prices in distant markets. These weren't simply brutal slave raiders. They were talent scouts who understood the subtle differences between regional beauty standards and cultural preferences that determined market value. Transportation specialists developed routes and logistic systems that minimized losses from disease, escape, and piracy while maintaining the health and appearance of their human cargo. The most successful operators invested heavily in custom-built ships with specialized compartments designed for human transport, complete with medical facilities, exercise areas, and even primitive entertainment systems to keep their cargo in good condition during long voyages. The training facilities that emerged in major trading centers represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the entire operation, functioning as combination universities, finishing schools, and medical centers that transformed raw recruits into highly skilled professionals capable of commanding premium prices. The largest of these, operated by Astrid the Traders Organization in Hedeby, housed nearly 200 women at its peak and employed dozens of instructors, medical personnel, and support staff. The curriculum was remarkably comprehensive. Students learned multiple languages, musical instruments, dancing, massage techniques, herbal medicine, and even basic mathematics and accounting skills that would help them manage their own finances. Sexual instruction was only one component of a broader education, designed to create cultured companions who could entertain clients intellectually as well as physically. Quality control mechanisms developed by commercial operators exceeded anything found in other medieval industries, with systematic testing, certification, and ongoing monitoring that protected both workers and clients while maintaining brand reputation. Established operations like Astrid's developed standardized evaluation procedures that assessed not only physical attributes but also personality traits. intelligence levels, and psychological stability that predicted success in different market segments. Women who showed aptitude for intellectual pursuits might be trained as companions for scholars and clergy, while those with natural charisma could be prepared for political and diplomatic roles. The most psychologically resilient candidates were selected for the highest risk, highest reward positions, serving foreign dignitaries and wealthy merchants who demanded absolute discretion and sophisticated entertainment. Financial innovations pioneered by the Viking sex trade influenced the development of medieval banking and international commerce in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The need to transfer large sums of money across vast distances without attracting unwanted attention led to the development of credit instruments, coded communications, and trust networks that facilitated not only human trafficking, but also legitimate international trade. Magnus, the coin counter's financial network, included branches in 12 different cities and employed sophisticated accounting methods that tracked complex multi-party transactions involving dozens of currencies and exchange rates. His organization pioneered the use of standardized contracts, performance bonds, and even primitive forms of derivatives trading that allowed operators to hedge against risks associated with political instability, currency fluctuations, and market volatility. The insurance mechanisms developed to protect investments in human cargo were particularly innovative, creating risk-sharing arrangements between multiple operators that distributed losses from shipwrecks, piracy, and political confiscation. These early insurance pools required sophisticated actuarial calculations that assessed the probability of various types of losses and established premium structures that reflected different levels of risk. The most successful operators diversified their investments across multiple routes, markets, and types of workers, creating portfolios that could survive individual disasters, while generating consistent profits over time. Yet, even as this commercial empire reached its peak in the late 10th century, the entire system was beginning to face new challenges from an unexpected source. The gradual conversion of Scandinavian rulers to Christianity wasn't just changing religious practices, it was fundamentally altering legal frameworks, social attitudes, and international relationships in ways that would force the sex trade to adapt or face extinction. By 995 CE, the collision between the old ways and the new faith had reached a breaking point that would determine the fate of thousands of women across the Norse world. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway had returned from his exile in England as a zealous Christian convert, determined to destroy every vestige of pagan practice in his realm, and the temple prostitutes and commercial sex traders represented everything he despised about the old religion. This wasn't simply a matter of moral reform or religious conviction. It was a calculated political campaign to consolidate royal power by destroying the independent economic and spiritual networks that had operated outside centralized control for centuries. The stakes were enormous: the survival of religious traditions that predated Christianity by millennia, the livelihoods of thousands of women who had built their lives around these practices, and the economic interests of powerful merchants and jarls who had grown wealthy from the sex trade. The king's campaign would pit brother against brother, destroy ancient alliances, and ultimately reshape the entire social fabric of Scandinavian society in ways that are still visible today. The crisis came to a head in the winter of 997 during what became known as the Siege of the Sacred Grove, a dramatic confrontation at the great temple of Uppsala that would become legendary in both Christian and pagan sources. King Olaf had arrived with a force of 300 Christian warriors, determined to destroy the temple complex and arrest the priestesses and temple prostitutes who served there. But the temple wasn't defenseless. Word of the king's approach had spread through the underground networks that connected pagan communities across Sweden, and by the time Olaf's forces arrived, the sacred grove was defended by nearly 500 warriors, led by Thorkel the Stubborn, a powerful Jarl who had refused conversion, and whose own daughter served as a Volva at the temple. The siege began not with violence, but with a theological debate that lasted 3 days, as Olaf attempted to convince the defenders to surrender peacefully and accept Christian baptism. The king's spokesman, a former pagan priest named Eric, who had converted after experiencing a vision of Christ, argued passionately that the old ways were demonic deceptions that enslaved women in degrading practices. But he was answered by Sigrid the Wise Woman, the eldest Volva at the temple, who delivered what the Icelandic sources describe as one of the most powerful speeches in Norse history. "You speak of freedom," she reportedly declared. "But what freedom is there in a religion that makes women ashamed of their bodies and their power? We serve the gods as our grandmothers did, and their grandmothers before them. We bring life into the world and pleasure to those who honor us. Your Christ promises only suffering and death." The debate might have continued indefinitely, but on the 4th day, a group of Christian zealots broke ranks and attempted to storm the temple gates. In the fighting that followed, 7 temple prostitutes were killed defending the sacred fire, including a young Irish woman named Deirdre, who had risen from slavery to become one of the most respected Volvas in the complex. The sight of these women fighting and dying for their beliefs shattered any pretense of peaceful conversion. When Thorkel himself fell defending the main temple building, pierced by 3 Christian spears, while protecting a group of pregnant temple servants, the remaining defenders knew their cause was lost. Rather than face capture and forced conversion, Sigrid and 12 other Volvas performed one final act of defiance. They drank a ritual poison made from yew berries and died within sight of the sacred tree, their bodies forming a circle around the altar where they had served for decades. The response was immediate and devastating, rippling across Scandinavia like shockwaves from an earthquake. In Norway, the news of the massacre triggered a series of revenge attacks against Christian settlements, as pagan jarls who had previously remained neutral rallied to defend what remained of the old religion. The powerful merchant families who had profited from the temple prostitution business found their trade networks disrupted and their political alliances shattered. Astrid the trader, whose commercial empire had depended on the stability of the old religious and social order, watched her carefully constructed business collapse within months as Christian kings across Scandinavia began issuing edicts against the sex trade. Some of her establishments were seized by royal officials, while others were burned by Christian mobs or abandoned by workers who feared for their lives. The immediate consequences weren't limited to economic disruption. The destruction of the temple prostitution system created a refugee crisis as hundreds of displaced women fled south and east, seeking safety in territories that still practiced the old ways. Many ended up in the Slavic territories along the Russian rivers, where they established new networks that would eventually evolve into entirely different forms of sex work. But perhaps most significantly, the massacre at Uppsala became a rallying cry for pagan resistance movements that would continue fighting Christian conversion for another century. The story of Sigrid the Wise Woman and her final defiance was preserved in dozens of poems and sagas, transforming these women from controversial religious figures into martyrs for traditional Norse values and female independence. The clash at Uppsala wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a carefully orchestrated political campaign that had been years in the making, involving diplomatic negotiations, economic pressure, and military threats that extended far beyond simple religious conversion. King Olaf Tryggvason's assault on the Viking sex trade was actually the culmination of a broader strategy designed to break the power of independent jarls and Volvas, who had traditionally served as checks on royal authority. The temple prostitutes and commercial sex networks represented more than moral challenges to Christian kingship. They were alternative sources of wealth, information, and political influence that competed directly with centralized royal power. Behind the scenes, Christian advisors had spent months developing what amounted to a comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy designed to identify and neutralize the key nodes in pagan resistance networks. Intelligence gathered by converted spies revealed the intimate connections between temple prostitution, Volvam networks, and political opposition to Christian rule. Royal officials had compiled detailed dossiers on major figures like Ingrid the Wise and Astrid the Traitor, mapping their business relationships, political alliances, and religious activities in preparation for coordinated strikes that would cripple pagan resistance while minimizing economic disruption to Christian merchants and allies. The economic warfare that preceded the military confrontation was equally sophisticated, involving targeted taxation, trade embargoes, and currency manipulation designed to weaken pagan institutions without triggering open rebellion. Christian kings negotiated secret agreements with Byzantine and Arabic trading partners to boycott goods produced by pagan-controlled operations, while simultaneously offering preferential trade terms to converted merchants, who agreed to abandon their traditional suppliers. The result was a gradual strangulation of the financial networks that supported temple prostitution and vulva activities, forcing many operators to choose between conversion and bankruptcy long before any soldiers appeared at their gates. 3-day theological debate that preceded the violent confrontation at Uppsala was itself a carefully choreographed political theater designed to provide legal and moral justification for what everyone knew would ultimately be decided by force of arms. Both sides understood that the real audience wasn't the defenders or attackers, but the broader population of jarls, merchants, and farmers whose support would determine the long-term success of Christian conversion efforts. King Olaf's spokesman Eric wasn't simply arguing theology. He was making a sophisticated political case that the old religious system was incompatible with the economic and military requirements of successful kingdoms in an increasingly Christian Europe. The pagan response, led by Sigrid the Wise Woman, revealed a deep understanding of the political stakes involved and attempted to frame the conflict in terms of cultural survival rather than religious doctrine. Her famous speech wasn't just a defense of traditional practices, but a prescient warning about the social and economic consequences of abandoning institutions that had provided essential services for centuries. She argued that Christian conversion would inevitably lead to the destruction of women's traditional roles and economic opportunities, the loss of medical and spiritual knowledge that took generations to accumulate, and the subordination of Scandinavian communities to foreign religious and political authorities who neither understood nor cared about local needs and customs. The military tactics employed during the siege reflected the broader strategic objectives of both sides, with the Christians focusing on capturing key buildings and religious artifacts that symbolized pagan authority, while the defenders concentrated on protecting the people and knowledge that represented the living heart of their religious tradition. The Christian assault wasn't a chaotic battle, but a methodical operation designed to seize specific targets that would maximize the propaganda value of victory while minimizing damage to infrastructure that could be repurposed for Christian use. Royal engineers had studied the temple complex for months, identifying structural weaknesses and planning siege approaches that would allow for rapid capture of the most symbolically important buildings. The pagan defense strategy revealed equally sophisticated military thinking, with defenders using their intimate knowledge of the temple grounds to create killing zones, escape routes, and hiding places that allowed them to inflict maximum casualties on attackers while preserving as many people and artifacts as possible. The decision by Sigrid and her followers to commit suicide rather than face capture wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation, but a calculated political statement. designed to create martyrs whose memory would inspire continued resistance to Christian rule. Their ritual deaths were carefully staged to invoke ancient traditions of sacrificial kingship and heroic death that would resonate powerfully with pagan audiences throughout Scandinavia. The intelligence networks that both sides employed during the conflict reveal a level of organizational sophistication that challenges conventional assumptions about medieval military capabilities. Christian forces had spent years infiltrating pagan religious and commercial networks, using converted former prostitutes and vulvas to gather detailed information about defensive preparations, supply routes, and political alliances that supported the Uppsala temple. These intelligence assets provided crucial tactical information about the layout of temple buildings, the location of hidden passages and treasure stores, and the personal relationships between different defenders that could be exploited to encourage defections or create internal conflicts. Pagan counterintelligence efforts were equally sophisticated, employing ancient spy networks that had originally been developed to gather information about trading opportunities and political developments across the Viking world. Vulvas had always served as informal intelligence coordinators, using their religious authority and mobility to collect and disseminate information about military movements, political alliances, and economic conditions that affected their communities. During the Uppsala crisis, these networks provided early warning about Christian military preparations and facilitated coordination between different pagan resistance groups that might otherwise have been unable to communicate effectively. The psychological warfare that accompanied the physical confrontation involved elaborate propaganda campaigns designed to influence public opinion and undermine enemy morale. Christian forces distributed carefully crafted stories about pagan atrocities, sexual perversions, and demonic influences that justified extreme measures against temple defenders. These propaganda narratives weren't simply crude hate speech, but sophisticated political communications that appealed to specific anxieties and aspirations among different segments of Scandinavian society. Merchants were told that Christian conversion would improve trade relationships with other European kingdoms, while farmers were promised that Christian agricultural practices would increase crop yields and reduce the risk of famine. Pagan propaganda efforts focused on preserving cultural memory and inspiring continued resistance by emphasizing the heroic traditions and practical benefits of the old religious system. Vulvas and skalds worked together to create epic poems and prophetic visions that portrayed the conflict as part of a cosmic struggle between freedom and slavery, wisdom and ignorance, natural harmony and artificial oppression. These cultural productions weren't just morale-boosting entertainment, but serious attempts to create alternative narratives that would sustain resistance movements even after the immediate military defeat of pagan forces. This confrontation wasn't just about competing religious systems or even the fate of individual women. It represented a fundamental clash between different concepts of royal authority, social organization, and the relationship between spiritual and temporal power. The temple prostitutes had operated as part of a decentralized religious system that distributed power among local communities, independent vulvas, and regional jarls who competed with royal authority. By destroying these networks, Christian kings weren't just imposing new religious beliefs. They were centralizing political control and eliminating alternative sources of spiritual and economic power that had traditionally checked royal ambitions. The implications extended far beyond Scandinavia, as the destruction of the Viking sex trade networks disrupted commercial relationships that had connected Northern Europe to Byzantium, the Islamic world, and the emerging kingdoms of Eastern Europe. The loss of these economic connections contributed to the gradual decline of Viking Age expansion and exploration, as the profits that had funded expeditions to Iceland, Greenland, and North America were no longer available. Perhaps most importantly, the persecution of temple prostitutes and vulvas marked the beginning of a broader campaign against women's spiritual and economic independence that would culminate in the witch trials of later centuries. The knowledge these women possessed of herbal medicine, sexual health, psychological counseling, and spiritual practices was either lost entirely or driven underground, contributing to what historians now recognize as a significant decline in women's status and autonomy across medieval Europe. The irony was profound. Christianity promised spiritual equality and moral redemption, but its triumph over the old religion actually reduced women's practical power and social options in ways that would take centuries to reverse. Around the central drama of religious conflict and commercial empire building, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in sustaining and shaping the world of Viking prostitution. Magnus the coin counter was a Danish merchant who specialized in the financing side of the sex trade, operating what amounted to medieval investment banking for brothel owners and slave traders. Unlike the flamboyant figures who captured the attention of saga writers, Magnus preferred to work in the shadows, providing startup capital for ambitious madams, arranging long-term loans for major slave purchases, and even offering primitive forms of insurance against the risks of shipwreck, piracy, and political upheaval that constantly threatened the industry. His detailed account books, discovered in a Danish bog in the 1960s, reveal the sophisticated financial instruments that made the large-scale sex trade possible. Contracts that specified interest rates, repayment schedules, and even performance bonuses for exceptionally profitable operations. Magnus represents the unglamorous but essential business infrastructure that supported more dramatic figures like Astrid the Trader, demonstrating how thoroughly commercialized and professionalized the Viking sex industry had become. Equally important was Hrothgar the Protector, a former warrior whose battle injuries had ended his raiding career, but who found new purpose as a security specialist for high-end brothels and escort services. Hrothgar wasn't just muscle for hire. He was a strategic thinker who developed sophisticated protection rackets, negotiated truces between competing establishments, and even created early forms of quality control by investigating client complaints and disciplining workers who violated professional standards. His network of disabled veterans provided security services across multiple cities, creating what amounted to the first professional private security force in medieval Europe. But Hrothgar's most significant contribution was his development of what we might today call human resources management. He created training programs for former prostitutes who wanted to transition into management roles, established retirement funds for workers who could no longer perform sexual services, and even negotiated with Christian authorities to provide sanctuary for women fleeing abusive situations. Then there was Gudrun the Healer, a Vava who specialized in the medical aspects of sex work, providing healthcare services that were essential to the industry's functioning. Gudrun operated a network of clinics that offered contraception, abortion services, treatment for sexually transmitted diseases, and even primitive forms of plastic surgery to repair damage from violence or disease. Her knowledge of herbal medicine was legendary. She could brew potions that prevented pregnancy for months at a time, ointments that healed vaginal tears within days, and stimulants that helped aging prostitutes maintain their sexual stamina. But Gudrun's most important innovation was her development of systematic health screening for both sex workers and their clients, creating protocols that significantly reduced the spread of disease and increased the working lifespan of women in the trade. Her detailed medical records, preserved in runic inscriptions found at several archaeological sites, provide our best evidence for the sophisticated healthcare systems that supported Viking-era sex work. These weren't isolated individuals operating independently. They were part of intricate webs of relationships that connected the sex trade to virtually every aspect of Viking society. Magnus the Coin Counter's financial network extended beyond simple brothel financing to include investments in slave ships, trading expeditions, and even legitimate businesses like taverns and boarding houses that served as fronts for sexual services. His partnerships with Astrid the Trader weren't limited to business loans. He also provided intelligence about market conditions, political developments, and competitor activities that helped her maintain her commercial dominance. When Christian persecution threatened their operations, Magnus used his political connections to negotiate protection, agreements with sympathetic Jarls, and even some newly converted kings who were willing to overlook moral concerns in exchange for substantial tax payments. The relationship between Hrothgar the Protector and Gudrun the Healer illustrates how different aspects of the industry supported each other in unexpected ways. Hrothgar's security services weren't just about preventing violence. They also included early warning systems that alerted Gudrun's clinics when diseased clients were operating in their areas, allowing her to take preventive measures that protected entire networks of sex workers. In return, Gudrun provided medical clearances that Hrothgar could use to certify the health and safety of his clients' establishments, creating quality assurance systems that increased customer confidence and justified premium pricing. Perhaps most significantly, these professional networks created opportunities for social mobility that were rare in medieval society. Ragnhild the Red, originally a Scottish slave captured during a raid on the Orkney Islands, rose through the ranks from prostitute to madam to eventually become one of Magnus's business partners, financing her own trading expeditions and slave purchasing operations. Her success wasn't unusual. The sex trade offered one of the few paths for women, especially foreign women, to accumulate significant wealth and social influence in Viking society. The interconnected nature of these relationships also created a form of mutual protection that helped the industry survive persecution and economic disruption. When King Olaf's campaigns forced the closure of major brothels in Norway, the networks developed by these supporting characters enabled rapid relocation of personnel and assets to safer territories, ensuring that knowledge and capital weren't permanently lost. To understand how these complex networks functioned, you have to understand the broader cultural context of Viking Age Scandinavia, where personal relationships, honor codes, and reciprocal obligations shaped every aspect of social and economic life. The concept of wergild, the practice of paying monetary compensation for crimes, rather than seeking blood vengeance, extended to the sex trade in ways that created sophisticated conflict resolution mechanisms. When disputes arose between brothel owners, or when clients accused sex workers of theft or fraud, the cases were often resolved through negotiated settlements that preserved business relationships while satisfying honor requirements. The importance of reputation in Viking culture meant that sex industry professionals had strong incentives to maintain high standards and honor their agreements, since a damaged reputation could destroy years of careful relationship building. The gift economy that characterized much of Viking social interaction also influenced the sex trade, with successful prostitutes and madams expected to provide hospitality, financial support, and even military assistance to their extended networks of clients, suppliers, and competitors. This wasn't simply prostitution as we understand it today. It was a complex system of mutual obligations and reciprocal relationships that integrated sexual services into the broader fabric of Viking society. Daily life in this world was governed by routines and rituals that would seem both familiar and alien to modern observers. Most high-end establishments operated according to strict schedules that allocated time for religious observances, medical examinations, skill training, and social activities, as well as sexual services. The women weren't simply available at all hours. They maintained regular working schedules, took days off for religious festivals, and even negotiated vacation time to visit family or participate in important social events. What was normal in this context was the acceptance of sex work as a legitimate profession that required specialized skills, ongoing education, and professional development. What was exceptional was the degree of autonomy and social mobility that successful practitioners could achieve, opportunities that were largely unavailable to women in other medieval professions. Perhaps most fascinating were the contradictions that permeated every aspect of this world, revealing tensions between ideals and reality that would be familiar to anyone studying the sex industry in any historical period. The same society that celebrated the vulvas as powerful spiritual figures also enslaved thousands of women and forced them into sexual servitude. Viking culture prided itself on honor and honesty in business dealings, yet the sex trade depended heavily on deception, fraud, and the exploitation of desperate people. The Norse gods were supposed to protect their worshippers, but temple prostitutes faced constant dangers from violence, disease, and social ostracism. Perhaps most ironically, the Christian conversion that promised to liberate women from degrading pagan practices actually reduced their economic opportunities and social autonomy, forcing many former temple prostitutes into more dangerous and less respected forms of sex work. These contradictions weren't unique to the Viking Age. They reflect fundamental tensions about sexuality, power, and women's roles that continue to shape debates about prostitution today, reminding us that the moral and practical challenges of regulating sex work are neither new nor easily resolved. Beneath the visible world of licensed establishments and official transactions operated a shadow economy of informants, facilitators, and intermediaries whose services were essential to the functioning of the entire system, but whose activities remained carefully hidden from official scrutiny. Eric the Whisperer was perhaps the most successful of these underground operators, a former skald who had lost his position at a royal court due to political intrigue and rebuilt his career by specializing in information brokerage and discreet problem-solving for the sex trade. Eric's network included corrupt officials who provided advance warning of raids and investigations, ship captains who smuggled women between territories without proper documentation, and even Christian clergy who secretly maintained business relationships with pagan operators. Despite their public opposition to the old ways, the intelligence-gathering capabilities of these underground networks rivaled those of royal courts and major trading houses, as sex workers and their managers were ideally positioned to observe and report on the private activities of powerful men throughout Scandinavian society. Eric maintained detailed files on the sexual preferences, financial problems, and political allegiances of hundreds of jarls, merchants, and clergy, information that could be used for blackmail, political manipulation, or simple business intelligence. His organization served as an informal communication system that allowed different operators to coordinate their activities, share information about dangerous clients, and collectively respond to threats from competitors or authorities. Perhaps most remarkably, Eric's network included a sophisticated early warning system that could predict political and economic changes that might affect the sex trade, allowing operators to relocate personnel and assets before official persecution campaigns began. This intelligence capability was based on careful observation of patterns in royal appointments, changes in tax policy, and shifts in religious rhetoric that experienced operators have learned to recognize as precursors to anti-prostitution campaigns. The system enabled the preservation of knowledge and relationships that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political upheaval, ensuring the survival and eventual revival of sex trade networks, even after apparent destruction by hostile authorities. The client base for Viking-era sex work extended far beyond simple commercial transactions to include complex webs of political patronage, diplomatic entertainment, and social networking that connected the industry to the highest Levels of Scandinavian society. Jarl Thorvald the Diplomatic, a powerful Norwegian nobleman who served as an unofficial ambassador to various European courts, maintained extensive relationships with high-end sex workers who provided not only personal services but also intelligence, gathering, and cultural interpretation that supported his political activities. Thorvald's approach to sexual commerce was strategic rather than recreational. He understood that beautiful, intelligent women could gain access to information and social circles that were close to male diplomats, making them valuable assets. In the complex world of medieval international relations, the most successful sex workers in Thorvald's network were essentially freelance intelligence agents who combined their sexual services with sophisticated espionage activities that provided their patron with detailed information about the political plans, economic conditions, and military capabilities of foreign kingdoms. These women were trained not only in sexual techniques, but also in observation skills, memory techniques, and coded communication methods that allowed them to gather and transmit sensitive information without arousing suspicion. Their success depended on their ability to maintain long-term relationships with powerful clients, while preserving their loyalty to their Scandinavian patrons, a delicate balancing act that required exceptional psychological skills and cultural adaptability. The political influence wielded by these client networks extended to domestic Scandinavian politics as well, as successful sex workers often became informal advisors and power brokers who could influence royal appointments, trade policies, and even military decisions through their relationships with key officials. Some vulvas use their sexual services as leverage to promote specific political candidates or policy positions, while others focused on gathering intelligence that could be used to predict and profit from political changes. The most sophisticated operators maintained carefully balanced portfolios of clients that represented different political factions, allowing them to preserve their influence regardless of which group gained power. The healthcare systems developed by Viking sex workers represented some of the most advanced medical knowledge available in medieval Europe, combining traditional Norse healing practices with innovations learned from international clients and adapted to the specific health challenges faced by people engaged in commercial sexual activity. Gunhild the Learned, a former Volval who had studied with healers across the known world, established what amounted to medieval medical schools that trained sex workers in diagnostic techniques, treatment protocols, and preventive care that were centuries ahead of their time. Gunhild's medical innovations included sophisticated understanding of reproductive health, sexually transmitted diseases, and psychological trauma that drew on knowledge from Celtic druids, Arabic physicians, Byzantine scholars, and even distant Eastern traditions transmitted through trading contacts. Her clinics provided services that ranged from contraception and abortion to treatment of sexual dysfunction and counseling for victims of sexual violence. The medical records maintained by her organization reveal a systematic approach to healthcare that included detailed case studies, treatment protocols, and even primitive statistical analysis of treatment outcomes. Perhaps most significantly, Gunhild's network served as a crucial bridge between traditional Norse healing practices and the emerging Christian medical traditions that were beginning to influence Scandinavian healthcare. Her practitioners were often the only healthcare providers available to women who had been marginalized by both pagan and Christian communities, making them essential sources of medical knowledge and treatment for some of the most vulnerable populations in Viking society. The preservation of this medical knowledge through oral traditions and practical training ensured that crucial healthcare innovations survived the religious and political upheavals of the conversion period, eventually influencing the development of medieval European medicine in ways that are only now being recognized by medical historians. Everything changed when King Canute the Great issued his comprehensive legal code in 1018, establishing the first systematic Christian regulations governing sexual behavior across his vast North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, and parts of Norway. Unlike the violent persecution campaigns of earlier Christian kings, Canute's approach was coldly administrative. He didn't seek to destroy the sex trade entirely, but rather to control, tax, and channel it in ways that served royal interests, while maintaining the facade of Christian morality. This wasn't a sudden religious awakening, but a calculated political strategy designed to consolidate royal power while avoiding the economic disruption and social unrest that had followed earlier attempts at prohibition. The king's legal scholars had studied the failures of previous Christian campaigns and concluded that total suppression was both impossible and counterproductive. Instead, they would create a regulatory framework that transformed illegal pagan prostitution into legal Christian concubinage, generating tax revenue while providing royal officials with convenient mechanisms for surveillance and social control. The turning point wasn't marked by dramatic confrontations or religious debates, but by the quiet circulation of new legal documents that redefined the entire landscape of sexual commerce across Northern Europe. For the first time in Scandinavian history, the state claimed direct authority over sexual relationships, marriage arrangements, and commercial transactions involving women's bodies, a precedent that would reshape European law for centuries to come. The transformation unfolded gradually over nearly 2 decades, as royal administrators worked systematically to replace the chaotic patchwork of local customs, religious traditions, and commercial practices with standardized legal procedures that could be implemented across different kingdoms and cultures. The process began with the establishment of licensing systems that required all women engaged in sexual commerce to register with royal officials, pay annual fees, and submit to regular medical examinations conducted by Christian clergy who had been trained in basic healthcare procedures. Resistance to these changes was immediate and widespread, but it took different forms in different regions. In Iceland, where the population was small and relatively homogeneous, opposition focused on preserving traditional vulva practices through secret societies that continued to perform fertility rituals and sexual magic in remote locations. Danish resistance was more commercially oriented, as established brothel owners and slave traders formed cartels designed to evade royal taxation and maintain their traditional profit margins. Norwegian opposition was the most violent, with former temple prostitutes and their supporters conducting guerrilla warfare against Christian administrators and collaborators throughout the 1020s and 1030s. But the royal response was patient and methodical rather than reactionary. Instead of launching punitive expeditions, Canute's officials used economic incentives, legal privileges, and social pressures to gradually win over key figures in the sex trade, who could influence their followers to accept the new system. The breakthrough came when Astrid the trader's successor, a former temple prostitute named Helga the Adaptable, negotiated a deal with royal officials that became the model for similar agreements across Scandinavia. In exchange for accepting Christian oversight and paying substantial taxes, Helga's organization received legal protection, exclusive territorial rights, and even royal endorsement for their marriage arrangement services, a euphemism that allowed them to continue operating brothels while maintaining the fiction of Christian morality. The agreement included provisions for worker safety, health standards, and dispute resolution that actually improved conditions for many sex workers, while generating enormous revenue for the royal treasury. Other operators quickly realized that cooperation was more profitable than resistance, and within a decade, most major sex trade networks had negotiated similar arrangements with Christian authorities. The process wasn't simply top-down imposition of royal will. It involved complex negotiations between competing interests that produced hybrid institutions combining pagan traditions, commercial practices, and Christian legal frameworks in ways that satisfied no one completely but provided benefits to all parties involved. The new system that emerged by 1040 was unlike anything that had existed before in European history. A state-regulated sex industry that operated under Christian legal authority while preserving many of the practical functions and social relationships of the old pagan system. Licensed marriage brokers operated establishments that provided sexual services under the legal fiction of temporary marriage contracts, allowing clients to enjoy prostitute services while maintaining their Christian respectability. The women involved were no longer temple prostitutes or commercial slaves, but marriage candidates who received legal protections, healthcare benefits, and even primitive forms of workers' compensation if they were injured or became pregnant during their service. Royal officials collected substantial taxes on these transactions, while maintaining detailed records that provided the crown with valuable intelligence about political alliances, commercial relationships, and potential security threats among the merchant and noble classes. Who won and who lost in this transformation was a complex calculation that varied dramatically depending on individual circumstances and regional conditions. Established madams and successful prostitutes often benefited from the new legal protections and exclusive territorial rights, while former temple priestesses lost their spiritual authority and social status even as they gained economic security. Male clients enjoyed safer and more predictable services, but at higher costs and with less variety than the old system had provided. The new rules were both more restrictive and more permissive than what had existed before, creating opportunities for some while closing doors for others. Women could no longer claim religious authority for their sexual practices, but they gained legal recourse against abusive clients and exploitative managers. The system was more expensive and bureaucratic, but also more stable and predictable than the chaotic networks that had operated under pagan rule. What stayed the same was the fundamental economic function of providing sexual services to traveling merchants, unmarried men, and others whose needs couldn't be met through conventional marriage arrangements. What changed dramatically was the social meaning and cultural context of these activities. Sex work was no longer a form of religious service or spiritual practice, but simply another form of commercial transaction subject to royal regulation and Christian moral oversight. The irony was that this Christianization of prostitution actually made it more widespread and institutionalized than it had ever been under pagan rule, as royal licensing systems legitimized and expanded markets that had previously operated in legal gray areas. Was this change ultimately positive or negative for the women involved and for society more broadly? The answer depends largely on your perspective and what aspects of the transformation you choose to emphasize. From a feminist viewpoint focused on women's autonomy and spiritual authority, the Christianization of Viking prostitution was clearly a step backward that reduced women's power, eliminated their religious roles, and subjected them to male-dominated bureaucratic control. The vulvas and temple priestesses had possessed genuine spiritual authority and social influence that was completely eliminated under the new system, replaced by the much more limited protections of Christian legal frameworks that still treated women as essentially the property of men. From an economic perspective, however, the new system provided greater security, better working conditions, and more opportunities for social mobility than the old networks had offered to most participants. The legal protections and health standards mandated by royal regulations significantly reduced the dangers faced by sex workers, while the licensing systems created barriers to entry that protected established operators from unfair competition. Short-term effects were generally positive for established players who could afford the licensing fees and comply with royal regulations, but devastating for marginal operators and independent workers who lacked the resources to navigate the new bureaucratic requirements. Long-term effects were more ambiguous, while the immediate violence and economic disruption of the conversion period gradually subsided. The loss of traditional knowledge and spiritual practices represented a permanent cultural impoverishment that could never be fully recovered. Unintended consequences included the emergence of underground markets for truly illegal sexual services that operated outside royal oversight, the development of new forms of sexual exploitation that took advantage of legal loopholes in the marriage contract system, and the creation of precedents for state regulation of intimate relationships that would eventually be extended to conventional marriages and family arrangements. Modern judgment tends to emphasize the loss of women's spiritual authority and a commercialization of relationships that had previously been understood in religious terms, while contemporary views were more focused on the practical benefits of legal protection and economic stability that the new system provided. The regulatory framework developed under King Canute's reforms represented one of the most sophisticated attempts at social engineering in medieval European history, creating legal precedents and administrative procedures that would influence governance systems across the continent for centuries to come. The challenge of regulating an industry that operated across multiple kingdoms, cultures, and legal traditions forced royal administrators to develop innovative approaches to jurisdiction, taxation, and enforcement that anticipated many features of modern international law. The standardized licensing contracts created by Canute's legal scholars included provisions for dispute resolution, quality standards, worker protection, and cross-border enforcement that represented unprecedented attempts to harmonize different legal systems while preserving local autonomy. The administrative machinery required to implement these regulations created new categories of government officials and professional specialists, whose expertise extended far beyond simple law enforcement. Royal commissioners responsible for sex trade oversight needed to understand international commerce, cultural differences, medical standards, and diplomatic protocols, in addition to basic legal principles. These officials often became some of the most knowledgeable and internationally connected members of royal administrations, serving as informal ambassadors and intelligence coordinators whose insights shaped foreign policy and commercial strategy throughout the North Sea region. Perhaps most significantly, the regulatory challenges posed by the sex trade forced medieval governments to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between private morality and public policy that remain central to political theory today. The compromise solutions developed by Canute's administration, legitimizing sexual commerce, while maintaining Christian moral rhetoric, created conceptual frameworks for distinguishing between individual sin and social crime that would eventually influence the development of secular legal systems throughout Europe. The precedent of regulating rather than prohibiting morally controversial activities provided templates for later attempts to manage gambling, usury, and other practices that were condemned by religious authorities but considered necessary for economic and social stability. In the decades that followed Canute's regulatory revolution, the Christianized sex trade evolved in directions that neither its architects nor its critics had anticipated, developing new institutions, practices, and social relationships that would influence European sexual culture for centuries to come. By 1050, the licensed marriage arrangement system had spread beyond Scandinavia to influence legal codes in England, Ireland, and even parts of the Holy Roman Empire. As rulers discovered the fiscal and administrative advantages of taxing and regulating prostitution rather than futilely attempting to suppress it, the royal licensing system generated enormous revenue. Surviving tax records from Denmark suggest that marriage broker fees accounted for nearly 15% of total royal income during some years, funding everything from church construction to military expeditions. But the most significant development was the gradual professionalization of avayernder, what had once been either religious service or simple commercial transaction. Licensed marriage brokers developed sophisticated training programs, quality control standards, and professional associations that resembled medieval guilds more than traditional brothel operations. These organizations lobbied for favorable legislation, negotiated collective bargaining agreements with client representatives, and even established pension funds for retiring workers. The system created new social categories and legal relationships that had never existed before. Women who were neither wives nor slaves, but professional contractors with specific rights and obligations under Christian law. Second generation effects included the emergence of a new merchant class specializing in the international trade of marriage contract services, connecting licensed establishments across different kingdoms and facilitating the movement of workers, clients, and capital between regions. The standardization of licensing procedures made it possible for experienced marriage brokers to relocate from Denmark to England or from Norway to Ireland, while maintaining their professional credentials and client networks. This mobility led to increased cultural exchange and the development of cosmopolitan sexual practices that blended traditions from different regions. Perhaps most unexpectedly, the Christian marriage broker system became a vector for preserving and transmitting elements of pagan sexual and spiritual knowledge that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Licensed establishments often employed former vulvas as medical consultants and spiritual advisors, allowing them to continue practicing herbalism, divination, and other traditional skills under the cover of Christian marriage counseling and healthcare services. The regulated system attracted a completely different type of entrepreneur than the old pagan networks had produced, as the emphasis shifted from spiritual authority and commercial cunning to legal expertise and administrative competence. Brother Thomas, the administrator, a former Benedictine monk who had been expelled from his monastery for financial irregularities, became one of the most successful marriage broker franchisees by applying monastic organizational methods to commercial sex work. His innovations included standardized accounting procedures, systematic record keeping, and quality control inspections that revolutionized the industry's efficiency and profitability. Thomas wasn't interested in the spiritual or cultural aspects of sex work. He approached it as a purely business proposition that required the same management techniques used in any other commercial enterprise. His success inspired dozens of imitators, creating a new professional class of Christian sex industry managers who possessed university education, legal training, and political connections that the old pagan operators had lacked. Equally important was the emergence of Matilda the Negotiator, a former Anglo-Saxon noblewoman who had lost her family estates during the Norman conquest and rebuilt her fortune by specializing in high-end marriage arrangement services for the diplomatic community. Matilda's contribution was her development of what amounted to international sexual diplomacy, providing sophisticated internment and intelligence-gathering services for foreign ambassadors, merchant delegations, and traveling nobility. Her establishments became neutral ground where representatives of hostile kingdoms could conduct informal negotiations, gather information about their rivals' intentions, and build personal relationships that often proved more durable than formal treaties. The women who worked for Matilda weren't just providing sexual services. They were trained in multiple languages, court etiquette, and diplomatic protocol, functioning as cultural interpreters and intelligence assets as much as companions. Her network extended from the court of King Henry I in England to the Byzantine Empire, creating informal communication channels that supplemented and sometimes superseded official diplomatic relations. The new system also produced Magnus the Reformer, a Danish legal scholar who dedicated his career to refining and improving the regulatory framework governing licensed marriage brokers. Magnus wasn't personally involved in the sex trade, but his legal innovations shaped its development in fundamental ways. He drafted model contracts that standardized the rights and obligations of workers, clients, and establishment owners, created arbitration procedures for resolving disputes, and even developed primitive forms of professional liability insurance that protected licensed operators against lawsuits and regulatory violations. His legal commentaries became standard references used throughout Northern Europe, and his principles influenced the development of commercial law far beyond the sex industry. Magnus represented the complete bureaucratization of relationships that had once been governed by personal honor, religious tradition, and informal negotiation. But some problems persisted despite the new legal framework, revealing fundamental tensions that no amount of regulation could completely resolve. The most intractable issue was the continued existence of underground markets that operated outside royal oversight, providing services that were either prohibited under Christian law or simply too expensive when conducted through licensed establishments. These illegal networks were often more dangerous and exploitative than anything that had existed under the old pagan system, precisely because they lacked any form of community oversight or professional standards. Women working in unlicensed operations faced greater risks of violence, disease, and abandonment, while clients had no legal recourse if they were cheated or harmed. The royal authorities found themselves in the paradoxical position of defending licensed prostitution against illegal competition, leading to enforcement campaigns that were often more violent and disruptive than the original pagan persecutions had been. New versions of old problems also emerged as licensed operators discovered ways to exploit legal loopholes and regulatory ambiguities. The marriage contract system was supposed to provide protection for sex workers, but clever lawyers found ways to draft agreements that effectively enslaved women while maintaining the appearance of Christian legitimacy. Some establishments used debt bondage to trap workers in permanent servitude, while others exploited the legal fiction of marriage to avoid paying the wages and benefits that were theoretically guaranteed under the licensing system. The regulatory agencies established to oversee the industry were often corrupted by the same operators they were supposed to control, leading to systematic violations of worker protection laws and quality standards. Cyclical patterns became apparent as the same social and economic pressures that had driven the original development of Viking prostitution continued to operate under the new Christian system. Periods of warfare and economic disruption led to increased demand for sexual services, while also creating new populations of displaced women who had few alternatives to sex work. The licensing system provided some protection during these cycles, but it also created artificial scarcities that drove up prices and encouraged illegal competition. Why certain issues proved intractable became clearer over time. The fundamental demand for commercial sexual services reflected deep-seated social needs that couldn't be eliminated through legal reform, while the supply of women willing to engage in sex work was driven by economic desperation and limited opportunities that regulatory changes couldn't address. The Christian marriage broker system had succeeded in controlling and taxing prostitution, but it hadn't solved the underlying social problems that made prostitution necessary or attractive to either providers or consumers. Compared to the earlier pagan period, the Christianized system was more stable, predictable, and legally protected, but also more expensive, bureaucratic, and culturally sterile. What had been lost was the spiritual meaning and community integration that had characterized temple prostitution, replaced by purely commercial relationships that reduce both workers and clients to economic actors in regulated markets. Compared to other places where Christianity had been imposed on traditional sexual practices, The Scandinavian model was remarkably successful in preserving the practical functions of prostitution, while adapting to new moral and legal requirements. In areas like Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England, Christian conversion had led to the complete suppression of organized sex work, driving it underground and making it far more dangerous and exploitative. The Viking approach of regulation rather than prohibition provided a template that would eventually influence the development of prostitution law throughout medieval Europe. What was unique about the Scandinavian experience was the relatively smooth transition from pagan to Christian systems, achieved through negotiation and compromise rather than violent suppression. This reflected the pragmatic political culture of the Viking kingdoms, where rulers were more interested in maintaining order and generating revenue than in enforcing ideological purity. What was universal was the tendency for legal regulation to create new forms of inequality and exploitation, even while providing greater security and protection for some participants. The lessons that could be learned from this historical experience remain relevant today. That prohibition of sexual commerce is generally ineffective and often counterproductive. That regulation can provide significant benefits but also creates new problems, and that the underlying social and economic factors driving prostitution must be addressed if policy reforms are to be truly successful. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the emergence of professional criminal organizations to serve illegal markets, the corruption of regulatory agencies by the industries they were supposed to control, and the persistence of exploitation and violence despite legal protections and quality standards. The regulated Christian system sparked a wave of technological and cultural innovations that transformed not only the sex trade, but also broader patterns of medieval life, commerce, and social organization. The need to maintain detailed records for tax and licensing purposes led to innovations in accounting methods, document storage, and information management that influenced the development of medieval bureaucracy throughout Northern Europe. Licensed marriage brokers pioneered the use of standardized contracts, performance metrics, and quality assessment tools that were later adapted by merchant guilds, craft associations, and even monastic communities seeking to improve their administrative efficiency. Cultural innovations were equally significant, as the marriage broker system created new forms of entertainment, social interaction, and artistic expression that blended Christian and pagan traditions in unexpected ways. The licensed establishments became centers for musical innovation, where performers from different cultural backgrounds collaborated to create new styles that combined Norse ballads with Celtic melodies, Byzantine chants, and Arabic musical techniques. These cultural fusion centers produced artistic innovations that influenced the development of medieval literature, music, and visual arts far beyond their original commercial context. The social rituals that developed around the marriage broker system created new forms of courtship, entertainment, and community celebration that shaped medieval European culture in lasting ways. The elaborate ceremonies that accompanied temporary marriage contracts influenced the development of conventional wedding traditions, while the entertainment practices developed in licensed establishments contributed to the evolution of medieval court culture and aristocratic social customs. Some historians argue that the Romantic literature traditions that emerged in medieval Europe owe significant debts to the cultural innovations pioneered in Christianized Viking brothels, where the combination of sexual services with intellectual and artistic entertainment created new models of romantic relationship that influenced literary and social ideals for centuries. The transformation of Viking sex work had profound implications for international relations and diplomatic practices throughout medieval Europe, as the networks that had facilitated informal communication and intelligence gathering between different kingdoms were fundamentally restructured. The licensed marriage broker system created new opportunities for diplomatic engagement, as establishments could serve as neutral ground for negotiations between hostile parties, while providing sophisticated entertainment and intelligence services that supported formal diplomatic efforts. The standardization of licensing procedures across different Viking kingdoms created precedents for international cooperation and regulatory harmonization that influenced the development of medieval international law. Treaties between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden included provisions for mutual recognition of marriage broker licenses, standardized quality standards, and cooperative enforcement mechanisms that anticipated modern concepts of international regulatory coordination. These agreements served as models for later treaties governing trade, navigation, and diplomatic immunity that would shape European international relations for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the diplomatic immunity and neutral status that licensed establishments enjoyed made them crucial venues for international espionage and intelligence gathering that shaped the balance of power throughout medieval Europe. The most successful marriage brokers became informal ambassadors, whose intelligence networks provided their royal patrons with detailed information about foreign military capabilities, political alliances, and economic conditions. The collapse of these networks during the later medieval period contributed to the diplomatic isolation and reduced international influence that characterized Scandinavian kingdoms during the transition from the Viking Age to early modern European state system. The later evolution of the Christian marriage broker system revealed its profound influence on the development of medieval European market economies, as the regulatory and commercial innovations pioneered in the sex trade were adapted to govern other forms of international commerce and cultural exchange. The credit instruments, insurance mechanisms, and quality control systems developed by sex trade entrepreneurs provided templates for the commercial law and business practices that supported the growth of medieval international trade. The professional training and certification programs developed for marriage brokers influenced the emergence of formal education systems and professional standards in other medieval industries. Guild systems throughout Northern Europe adopted elements of the comprehensive training curricula, quality assessment methods, and professional development programs that have been pioneered in the Viking sex trade. The emphasis on international languages, cultural competency, and diplomatic skills that characterized marriage broker education contributed to the development of medieval university curricula and the emergence of professional diplomatic services. Most importantly, the international networks that connected marriage broker establishments across different kingdoms created commercial and cultural exchange systems that survived the eventual decline of the sex trade itself. Former marriage brokers often became merchants, innkeepers, and cultural intermediaries who maintained the various international connections and cross-cultural expertise that had been developed during their previous careers. These personal and professional networks provided crucial infrastructure for the expansion of medieval European trade and cultural exchange that would eventually lead to the Age of Exploration and the development of global commercial systems. By 1150, signs pointed to fundamental changes that would ultimately transform the entire landscape of Northern European sexual commerce beyond recognition. The marriage broker system that had seemed so stable and profitable during the early 12th century was beginning to show cracks under pressure from multiple directions that its architects had never anticipated. The rise of powerful merchant guilds in major trading cities created new forms of economic organization that competed directly with the licensing systems that had given royal authorities control over commercial sex work. These guilds weren't interested in maintaining the fiction of Christian marriage contracts. They wanted straightforward, commercial relationships that maximize profits without regard for religious sensibilities or royal prerogatives. Warning signs included a series of strikes by licensed marriage brokers protesting increased taxation and regulatory interference. the emergence of guild-sponsored brothels that operated outside royal oversight, and growing criticism from church reformers who argued that the licensing system was a hypocritical compromise that corrupted both secular and religious authority. What key players could see was that the economic foundations of the Viking Age were crumbling as new trade routes, political alliances, and cultural patterns reduced the importance of Scandinavian commercial networks. The Crusades had opened direct connections between Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire that bypassed traditional Viking intermediaries, while the rise of powerful monarchies in England and France created alternative sources of luxury goods and exotic products that had once flowed exclusively through Norse trading posts. What they missed was how quickly these changes would accelerate once they reached a critical mass. The gradual decline of Viking political power, the increasing integration of Scandinavian kingdoms into broader European political systems, and the growing influence of continental Christianity all contributed to an environment where the distinctive features of Norse sexual culture seemed increasingly anachronistic and problematic. Resistance to inevitable change took multiple forms, but most attempts to preserve the old systems were doomed by their failure to address the underlying economic and political shifts that were driving transformation. Some licensing authorities tried to maintain their relevance by expanding into new areas like marriage counseling and family mediation, while others attempted to form alliances with merchant guilds and urban authorities. The most conservative operators simply ignored changing conditions and continued operating as if nothing had changed, a strategy that worked temporarily but ultimately proved catastrophic when the final collapse came. The end of the distinctive Viking prostitution system didn't come through dramatic confrontation or royal decree, but through a series of incremental changes that gradually rendered the old institutions irrelevant and unsustainable. The decisive moment came in 1171 when King Valdemar I of Denmark issued a comprehensive legal code that abolished the marriage broker licensing system and transferred regulation of sexual commerce to municipal authorities and church courts. This wasn't motivated by moral concerns or religious pressure, but by practical recognition that the royal bureaucracy could no longer effectively control or tax an industry that had become too dispersed, specialized, and integrated into broader urban economies to be managed through centralized licensing. The new legal framework treated prostitution as a municipal nuisance to be regulated by local authorities rather than a source of royal revenue to be protected and expanded. The final major players in this transformation were not the colorful entrepreneurs and spiritual leaders who had dominated earlier periods, but anonymous bureaucrats and legal scholars who quietly rewrote the laws and administrative procedures that governed sexual commerce. The last attempts to preserve elements of the old system came from unlikely sources: former temple prostitutes who had become successful marriage brokers and wanted to maintain their professional status, and church officials who had grown comfortable with the revenue and political influence that licensing systems provided. Their final efforts focused on negotiating grandfather clauses and transition periods that would allow existing operations to continue under modified regulations. But these compromises satisfied no one and merely prolonged the inevitable. Dramatic final moments were rare, but the symbolic endpoint came in 1186 when the last licensed marriage broker establishment in Copenhagen closed its doors and converted to a conventional tavern. The building had operated continuously as a center of sexual commerce for nearly 2 centuries, under both pagan and Christian authority, but changing economic conditions and new legal restrictions had finally made the operation unprofitable. The closing received little attention at the time. No chronicles recorded it, no sagas commemorated it, and few contemporaries understood its historical significance. But modern historians recognize it as marking the end of an era when organized prostitution had been an accepted and regulated part of Scandinavian society. The analysis of causes reveals a complex interaction of internal problems and external pressures that made the transformation inevitable, regardless of what individual players might have done differently. Internal problems included the bureaucratic bloat and corruption that had gradually undermined the efficiency and legitimacy of royal licensing systems. The failure to adapt to changing economic conditions and customer preferences, and the persistent tensions between Christian moral ideology and practical commercial needs that had never been satisfactorily resolved. The marriage broker system had always been a compromise that satisfied no one completely, and by the 12th century, the contradictions had become too obvious to ignore. External pressures were equally important in driving change. The rise of urban merchant classes created alternative sources of political and economic power that competed directly with royal authority, while the increasing influence of continental European legal traditions introduced new concepts of municipal governance and church authority that were incompatible with the distinctive Scandinavian approach to regulating sexual commerce. The gradual integration of Nordic kingdoms into broader European political and economic systems meant that local customs and institutions had to conform to international standards or risk being marginalized and eventually eliminated. The role of individuals versus historical forces in driving these changes is difficult to assess, but it seems clear that individual decisions and personalities were less important than broader structural trends that were largely beyond any single person's control. What could have been done differently is a matter of speculation, but it's hard to imagine how the distinctive features of Viking-era prostitution could have survived the Viking-era prostitution could have survived the fundamental transformation of Scandinavian society that occurred during the High Medieval period. The question of inevitability versus contingency remains debated among historians, but the weight of evidence suggests that some form of transformation was inevitable, even if the specific timing and details were influenced by contingent factors and individual choices. The immediate aftermath was characterized by fragmentation and improvisation, as the various functions that the old licensing system had performed were taken over by different institutions and authorities. Municipal governments assumed responsibility for basic regulation and taxation, while church courts handled matters involving marriage, sexual morality, and family relationships. The professional associations that had developed among licensed marriage brokers either disbanded entirely or transformed themselves into conventional merchant guilds focused on other commercial activities, who stepped into the vacuum left by the collapse of royal licensing systems varied dramatically from place to place. In some cities, merchant guilds took control of commercial sex work, while in others, church authorities assumed direct responsibility for regulation and oversight. Short-term consequences included a period of legal uncertainty and economic disruption as operators and clients struggled to understand and adapt to new rules and institutions. Some former marriage brokers successfully transitioned to conventional business careers in hospitality, entertainment, or retail trade, while others were unable to adapt and either retired or moved to regions where older systems persisted longer. The immediate impact on sex workers themselves was mixed. Some benefited from increased competition among different regulatory authorities, while others found themselves with reduced legal protections and economic security. Contemporary reactions were generally muted, reflecting the gradual nature of the transformation and the fact that most people were more concerned with immediate practical adjustments than with broader historical significance. The most vocal responses came from church reformers who celebrated the end of what they saw as a corrupt and immoral compromise, and from conservative nobles who lamented the loss of traditional royal prerogatives and customary relationships. Attempts at revival or continuation were sporadic and generally unsuccessful, as the economic and political conditions that had made the old system viable no longer existed. By 1200, the distinctive institutions of Viking-era prostitution had disappeared so completely that most contemporaries had difficulty imagining how they had ever functioned or why they had seemed necessary and natural to previous generations. The collapse of the Viking prostitution system triggered a massive intellectual and cultural diaspora that dispersed specialized knowledge, artistic traditions, and social practices across medieval Europe in ways that would influence cultural development for centuries. The former vaudois, temple prostitutes, and marriage brokers who found themselves displaced by the new order carried with them sophisticated understanding of medicine, psychology, linguistics, and cultural practices that had been developed over generations of international interaction. Many of these women became traveling healers, midwives, and cultural interpreters who preserved and transmitted knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the transition from the Viking Age to High Medieval period. The most remarkable aspect of this diaspora was the establishment of informal networks that connected displaced practitioners across vast geographical distances, creating what amounted to underground universities that preserved and developed the intellectual traditions of the Viking sex trade. Former temple prostitutes who had settled in monasteries as lay sisters often maintained secret correspondence with colleagues who had established themselves as herbalists in distant cities, sharing medical knowledge and spiritual practices that blended pagan and Christian traditions in innovative ways. These networks facilitated the preservation of linguistic knowledge, as women who had learned multiple languages during their careers continued to serve as translators and cultural intermediaries, long after their original profession had disappeared. Perhaps most significantly, the cultural innovations that had emerged from the Viking sex trade were preserved and transmitted through informal artistic and intellectual networks that influenced the development of medieval European culture in subtle but profound ways. The musical traditions, literary forms, and artistic techniques that had been developed in cosmopolitan brothels and temple complexes were adapted and integrated into conventional medieval cultural institutions, often without acknowledgement of their origins. Some scholars argue that the courtly love traditions that emerged in medieval European literature owe significant debts to the romantic and sexual practices that had been pioneered in Viking-era sex work, where the combination of physical intimacy with intellectual and artistic sophistication had created new models of human relationship that transcended simple commercial transaction. The economic disruption caused by the collapse of the licensing system revealed the extent to which the Viking sex trade had become integrated into broader patterns of medieval commerce and finance, with ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence international trade, urban development, and monetary policy throughout Northern Europe. The sudden loss of tax revenue from marriage broker licenses forced royal governments to develop alternative sources of income, leading to innovations in taxation methods and fiscal administration that would shape medieval European economic development. For centuries, the commercial networks that had supported the international sex trade were forced to adapt to new legal and social conditions, often by diversifying into other forms of entertainment, hospitality, and cultural services that preserved essential functions while avoiding the religious and moral controversies associated with explicit sexual commerce. Many former brothels were converted into taverns, boarding houses, and entertainment venues that continued to provide unofficial sexual services while maintaining the appearance of conventional commercial establishments. The most successful of these adaptations involved the development of new forms of cultural and social services that met the same underlying human needs that had driven demand for traditional prostitution. The financial innovations that had been pioneered by the Viking sex trade continued to influence medieval European economic development long after the original institutions had disappeared. The credit instruments, insurance mechanisms, and international banking procedures that had been developed to support human trafficking and sexual commerce were adapted to serve conventional merchants and traders who needed similar financial services for legitimate commercial activities. Some of the most important medieval European banking houses trace their origins to financial networks that had originally been established to support the Viking sex trade, demonstrating the complex and often hidden connections between marginal commercial activities and mainstream economic development. The legal precedents established during the regulation and eventual dissolution of the Viking sex trade created institutional frameworks and procedural innovations that influenced the development of medieval European law in fundamental ways. The challenge of regulating an industry that operated across multiple jurisdictions and cultural boundaries had forced medieval legal scholars to develop new concepts of territorial sovereignty, international cooperation, and regulatory enforcement that anticipated many features of modern legal systems. The dispute resolution mechanisms that had been developed to handle conflicts within the sex trade became models for commercial arbitration and conflict resolution that were eventually adopted by merchant guilds, craft associations, and even diplomatic services throughout medieval Europe. The emphasis on contractual relationships, performance standards, and quality control that had characterized the marriage broker system influenced the development of commercial law and business practices that extended far beyond sexual commerce to shape the evolution of medieval capitalism and international trade. Perhaps most importantly, the legal debates surrounding the regulation and eventual prohibition of Viking-era prostitution forced medieval legal scholars to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between individual liberty and social control that would continue to influence European legal development for centuries. The precedents established during this period regarding the state's authority to regulate private moral behavior, the rights of individuals to engage in consensual commercial relationships, and the balance between religious moral authority and secular legal jurisdiction created conceptual frameworks that would eventually influence the development of modern concepts of individual rights, religious freedom, and governmental authority. The legacy of Viking-era prostitution shaped later European developments in ways that historians are only beginning to understand, creating precedents and institutional models that influenced legal systems, commercial practices, and social attitudes towards sexuality for centuries after the original institutions had disappeared. The most direct influence was on the development of medieval urban law, particularly the legal frameworks governing commercial activities and municipal regulation that emerged in the great trading cities of the 13th and 14th centuries. The sophisticated licensing systems, professional standards, and dispute resolution mechanisms that had been pioneered in the Viking marriage broker industry provided templates for regulating other forms of commerce that required close government oversight, from banking and money lending to guild manufacturing and international trade. Legal scholars in universities across Europe studied and adapted Scandinavian regulatory models, not because they were particularly interested in prostitution, but because the Viking kingdoms had developed some of the most advanced administrative techniques for managing complex commercial relationships. Specific influences can be traced through the evolution of commercial law in major trading centers like London, Paris, and Venice, where legal codes governing professional licensing, quality control, and consumer protection borrowed heavily from Scandinavian precedents. The concept of professional associations with self-governing authority, standardized training requirements, and collective bargaining rights, fundamental features of the medieval guild system, had been pioneered in the Viking sex trade decades before they appeared in other industries. How later generations viewed these developments was complicated by the moral stigma attached to their origins. leading to a systematic erasure of the prostitution connections from official legal histories. Medieval lawyers and administrators quietly adapted Viking innovations while carefully avoiding any mention of their original context, creating a historical amnesia that obscured the sex trade's contributions to European legal development. Myths versus realities that developed around Viking sexuality reflected broader cultural anxieties about women's power, sexual autonomy, and the relationship between Christianity and pre-Christian traditions. The popular image of Viking women as either helpless victims or savage barbarians served to justify the destruction of institutions that had actually provided significant opportunities for female economic independence and social mobility. Why these institutions remained important to some groups while being forgotten by others reveals the political dimensions of historical memory. Feminist scholars and advocates for sex workers' rights have rediscovered Viking prostitution as evidence that commercial sex work hasn't always been associated with exploitation and social marginalization. While conservative religious groups prefer to emphasize the conversion narrative as a story of moral progress and spiritual liberation, today, we can see echoes of Viking-era debates about prostitution regulation in contemporary discussions about sex work, legalization, worker protection, and the relationship between moral legislation and practical policy outcomes. The fundamental tension between prohibition and regulation that characterized the Christian conversion period mirrors current debates about whether governments should attempt to eliminate commercial sex work entirely or focus on making it safer and more equitable for the women involved. Specific parallels include the ongoing struggle between advocates for complete decriminalization and supporters of the Nordic model that criminalizes clients while providing services for sex workers, a debate that directly echoes the medieval conflict between those who wanted to destroy the Viking sex trade entirely and those who preferred to regulate and tax it. What hasn't changed about human nature is the persistence of demand for commercial sexual services regardless of legal restrictions or moral prohibitions, and the tendency for prohibition to drive the industry underground where it becomes more dangerous and exploitative rather than eliminating it entirely. The Viking experience demonstrates that societies have successfully regulated prostitution without moral panic or social collapse, challenging modern assumptions about the inevitability of either complete prohibition or uncontrolled commercialization. Similar patterns in different contexts can be observed in the development of sex work regulation in places like the Netherlands, Germany, and New Zealand, where legal frameworks have evolved to balance worker protection, public health concerns, and moral considerations in ways that echo the pragmatic approach pioneered by Viking kings 1,000 years ago. The role of religious and moral ideology in shaping prostitution policy remains as contentious today as it was during the medieval conversion period, with secular feminists, religious conservatives, and sex workers themselves often advocating for incompatible approaches that reflect deeper disagreements about sexuality, gender roles, and the proper scope of government regulation. Lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of involving sex workers themselves in policy discussions, the need to address underlying economic inequalities that drive women into sex work, and the recognition that moral legislation often produces unintended consequences that harm the very people it claims to protect. Even now, Viking approaches to prostitution regulation continue to influence academic study, popular culture, political discourse, and social movements in ways that extend far beyond historical scholarship. Academic research on sex work has been profoundly shaped by the rediscovery of Viking sources that challenge convent, IONAL narratives about the inevitability of exploitation and marginalization in commercial sexual relationships. Popular culture representations of Viking women increasingly emphasize their economic independence and sexual agency, drawing explicitly on historical evidence about temple prostitutes and vulvas to counter stereotypes about medieval women's powerlessness. Political discourse around sex work policy frequently references historical precedents for successful regulation, with advocates on multiple sides citing Viking examples to support their positions about the feasibility and desirability of different regulatory approaches. Social movements defending sex workers' rights have embraced the example of Viking temple prostitutes as evidence that commercial sex work can be integrated into broader social and economic systems without causing moral or practical disasters. Why people still care about these historical precedents reflects contemporary anxieties about sexuality, women's autonomy, and the relationship between individual choice and social control that remain as contentious today as they were a millennium ago. The Viking example provides ammunition for arguments about human nature, cultural change, and the possibilities for creating more equitable and humane approaches to regulating intimate relationships and commercial activities. The influence extends beyond direct policy debates to broader cultural conversations about the relationship between sexuality and spirituality, the role of women in religious and economic life, and the possibilities for organizing society in ways that respect both individual autonomy and community values. The vulvas and temple prostitutes represent alternative models of female power and spiritual authority that continue to inspire contemporary feminist and pagan movements, seeking to recover suppressed traditions and create new forms of women-centered spirituality. Their example challenges both secular feminist assumptions about the inevitability of patriarchal oppression and conservative religious claims about the universality of traditional gender roles and sexual morality. The practical relevance of Viking prostitution history to contemporary policy debates extends beyond simple historical curiosity to provide concrete evidence about the possibilities and limitations of different regulatory approaches. The Scandinavian experience demonstrates that societies can successfully integrate commercial sex work into broader legal and economic systems without experiencing moral collapse or social disintegration, challenging both prohibitionist arguments about the inherent dangers of legalized prostitution and libertarian claims that complete deregulation will automatically produce optimal outcomes. The evolution from pagan temple prostitution to Christian marriage broker systems to municipal regulation illustrates how sex work institutions can adapt to changing social conditions while maintaining their essential functions, providing insights relevant to contemporary discussions about how to balance worker protection, public health, and moral concerns. The international dimensions of the Viking sex trade offer particularly relevant insights for modern policymakers dealing with globalized markets and cross-border trafficking concerns. The sophisticated networks that connected Irish slaves to Byzantine markets and Slavic women to Nordic clients created both opportunities for exploitation and mechanisms for worker protection and social mobility that parallel contemporary debates about migration, labor rights, and international cooperation in addressing human trafficking. The Viking example suggests that effective regulation requires international coordination and standardized approaches that recognize the reality of cross-border movement while protecting vulnerable workers from exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking experience highlights the crucial role of economic inequality and limited opportunities for women in driving participation in sex work, suggesting that effective policy must address underlying social conditions rather than simply focusing on the regulation of sexual commerce itself. The most successful Viking-era sex workers were those who used the industry as a stepping stone to broader economic and social opportunities, while the most exploited were those who lacked alternatives or resources to negotiate better working conditions. This pattern remains visible in contemporary sex markets. where policy approaches that focus exclusively on moral or legal questions while ignoring economic realities consistently fail to achieve their stated goals of protecting vulnerable women or reducing social problems associated with prostitution. The historical record also provides sobering evidence about the limitations of regulatory approaches that fail to address fundamental power imbalances between workers and clients, operators and authorities, or local communities and international markets. Even the most sophisticated Viking licensing systems were vulnerable to corruption, exploitation, and political manipulation, suggesting that effective regulation requires ongoing vigilance and adaptation rather than simple implementation of optimal policies. The ultimate decline of the Viking system resulted not from moral failings or regulatory inadequacies, but from broader social and economic changes that made the original institutional arrangements obsolete, reminding contemporary policymakers that even successful approaches to sex work regulation must be prepared to evolve as social conditions change. The information networks and communication systems developed by Viking sex workers bear striking resemblances to contemporary digital platforms and online communities that facilitate modern sex work, revealing surprising continuities between medieval and digital age approaches to managing commercial sexual relationships. The sophisticated intelligence gathering and client screening procedures pioneered by vulvas and marriage brokers, anticipated many features of modern online reputation systems, background checking services, and digital security protocols that sex workers use to protect themselves in contemporary markets. The Viking emphasis on professional networking, skill development, and knowledge sharing through informal educational systems parallels the online communities and resource sharing platforms that modern sex workers use to exchange information about safety procedures, legal rights, and business practices. Just as medieval vulvas maintained international networks for sharing medical knowledge and spiritual practices, contemporary sex workers use digital platforms to coordinate advocacy efforts, share safety information, and provide mutual support across geographical and cultural boundaries. The regulatory challenges posed by Viking-era international sex trafficking networks offer particularly relevant insights for contemporary efforts to address online prostitution and digital sex commerce. The medieval experience with licensing systems, quality control mechanisms, and cross-border enforcement cooperation provides historical precedents for current debates about platform regulation, international legal cooperation, and the balance between worker protection and technological innovation. The ultimate failure of medieval regulatory systems to adapt to changing technological and social conditions serves as a cautionary example for contemporary policymakers who must navigate the rapid pace of digital innovation while protecting vulnerable populations. The complex relationship between spiritual authority, economic independence, and sexual autonomy that characterized Viking-era sex work provides crucial historical evidence for contemporary feminist debates about agency, empowerment, and the intersection of sexuality with broader patterns of gender oppression and liberation. The example of vulvas, who wielded genuine religious and social power while engaging in commercial sexual activities, challenges both sex-positive feminist arguments about the inherently empowering potential of sex work and radical feminist claims about the inevitably oppressive nature of commercial sexual relationships. The Viking experience reveals the importance of broader social context in determining whether sex work functions as a source of empowerment or exploitation for the women involved. In societies where women possessed alternative sources of economic and social power, sex work could serve as a pathway to greater autonomy and influence. But in contexts where women lacked other opportunities or legal protections, the same activities became mechanisms of oppression and marginalization. This historical evidence supports contemporary feminist arguments that the impact of sex work on women's lives cannot be determined by examining sexual commerce in isolation, but must be understood within broader patterns of gender inequality and social structure. The preservation and transmission of women's knowledge through sex work networks also provides important historical precedents for contemporary discussions about women's intellectual contributions and the ways that marginalized communities maintain and develop specialized expertise. The medical, linguistic, and cultural knowledge preserved by Viking sex workers demonstrates how women's informal educational and professional networks can serve crucial social functions, even when they operate outside official institutional frameworks, offering models for contemporary feminist efforts to recognize and support women's intellectual and professional achievements in non-traditional contexts. Looking back across 3 centuries of Viking-era sexual commerce, we've seen a remarkable transformation that reveals fundamental truths about human nature, social organization, and the complex relationships between sexuality, spirituality, and political power. The journey began with the sophisticated religious institutions of pagan Scandinavia, where vulvas and temple prostitutes wielded genuine spiritual authority while providing essential social services to communities that stretched from Iceland to the Black Sea. These women weren't marginalized outcasts, but respected professionals who combined sexual expertise with herbal medicine, psychological counseling, and divination services that connected the sacred and secular aspects of Norse life in ways that modern observers struggle to understand. Key patterns emerged as we trace the evolution from religious service to commercial enterprise, revealing how economic pressures and cultural changes gradually transformed intimate spiritual practices into sophisticated business operations that generated enormous profits while preserving elements of traditional knowledge and social relationships. The most surprising discoveries included the sheer scale and international scope of these networks, the high degree of professional organization and quality control that developed within the industry, and the remarkable social mobility that successful sex workers could achieve in a society that was otherwise rigidly hierarchical and male-dominated. The story of Astrid the Trader's multinational corporation, Magnus the Coin Counter's financial innovations, and Hrothgar the Protector's security services reveal a level of commercial sophistication that challenges modern assumptions about medieval economic capabilities and organizational structures. The most important takeaways include the recognition that prostitution regulation is neither a modern invention nor an inherently doomed enterprise. Societies have successfully managed commercial sex work for extended periods while maintaining social stability and protecting worker welfare. The Viking experience demonstrates that effective regulation requires balancing multiple competing interests and adapting to changing social conditions rather than implementing rigid moral or ideological solutions. How our understanding has evolved throughout this journey reflects the complexity of historical truth. Simple narratives about exploitation versus liberation, or tradition versus progress, consistently failed to capture the nuanced realities of how these institutions actually functioned and why they persisted for so long despite facing persistent challenges and opposition. The story that perhaps best encapsulates all these broader themes is the remarkable tale of Ragnhild the Chronicler, a former Irish slave who became one of our most important sources for understanding the daily realities of Viking-era sex work. Captured during a raid on a monastery in County Cork around 960 CE, Ragnhild was initially sold to a temple in Uppsala, where she spent 5 years learning Norse language and customs while serving as a temple prostitute. But unlike most women in her position, Ragnhild possessed the rare skill of literacy. She had been educated by the monks before her capture and retained her ability to read and write in Latin. When the temple was destroyed during the Christian persecutions, She fled to Denmark, where she eventually found employment with one of Astrid the Trader's successors, using her linguistic abilities to communicate with international clients and maintain business records. What makes Ragnhild's story so significant is that she left behind a detailed diary written in a mixture of Latin, Old Norse, and Gaelic that provides our only first-person account of what life was actually like for women working in the Viking sex trade. Her writings reveal both the brutal realities of sexual slavery and the unexpected opportunities for intellectual and spiritual growth that some women found within these institutions. She describes the complex relationships between workers and clients, the intricate social hierarchies within brothel communities, and the day-to-day challenges of maintaining health, safety, and dignity in an often dangerous profession. But her most moving passages describe the friendships and surrogate family relationships that developed among women who shared common experiences of displacement, exploitation, and survival. Ragnhild's final entries, written shortly before her death from plague in 1087, reflect on the profound changes she had witnessed during her lifetime. She had seen the transformation from pagan temple prostitution to Christian marriage brokerage, the rise and fall of great commercial empires, and the gradual integration of Scandinavian society into broader European cultural and political systems. Her assessment was characteristically nuanced. She mourned the loss of spiritual meaning and community solidarity that had characterized the old temple systems, but acknowledged the improved legal protections and economic opportunities that Christian regulation had provided for many women. Most poignantly, she worried about the younger generation of sex workers who had never experienced the sense of sacred purpose that had sustained her through decades of difficult and dangerous work. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes is that Ragnhild's life trajectory, from religious captive to commercial worker to historical chronicler, mirrors the broader transformation of Scandinavian society during the Viking Age. Her individual struggles with questions of identity, belonging, and purpose reflected the larger cultural tensions between tradition and change, spiritual meaning and material necessity, personal autonomy and social constraint that shaped the entire era. What it reveals about the human dimensions of historical change is that grand political and religious transformations were experienced by ordinary people as intimate personal challenges requiring constant adaptation, compromise, and resilience. The memorable final image that emerges from Ragnhild's chronicle is her description of the last Volva she knew, an elderly woman named Thora who continued practicing the old fertility rituals in secret. Long after the official conversion to Christianity, Thora would gather small groups of women in forest clearings during the full moon, performing ceremonies that combined ancient Norse traditions with Christian prayers and contemporary medical knowledge. These gatherings weren't acts of rebellion against the new religion, but attempts to preserve valuable knowledge and meaningful relationships that might otherwise be lost. Ragnhild's final entry describes participating in one of these ceremonies shortly before Thora's death, feeling a profound connection to generations of women who had faced similar challenges, while struggling to maintain their dignity and purpose. In a rapidly changing world, as we reach the end of this long journey through the hidden corners of Viking history, it's worth reflecting on what these stories of forgotten women and vanished institutions can teach us about the persistence of human needs and desires across the centuries. The Volvas and temple prostitutes, the merchants and madams, the slaves and entrepreneurs who populated this world were grappling with fundamental questions about sexuality, spirituality, economic survival, and social belonging that remain as relevant today as they were a millennium ago. Their solutions were imperfect and often contradictory, shaped by the particular constraints and opportunities of their historical moment. But their struggles and achievements remind us that there are no simple answers to the complex challenges of organizing human relationships in ways that respect both individual autonomy and community values. The gentle lesson that emerges from this exploration is that moral panics and ideological crusades, whether pagan or Christian, secular or religious, consistently fail to address the underlying human needs that drive people toward commercial sexual relationships. The most successful approaches, whether ancient or modern, have been those that acknowledge complexity, embrace pragmatism, and focus on practical outcomes rather than theoretical purity. The Viking experience suggests that societies can adapt their institutions to changing moral and religious climates while preserving essential functions and protecting vulnerable people, but only through patient negotiation and careful attention to unintended consequences. Perhaps the most important insight for our contemporary world is the recognition that the challenges we face in addressing prostitution, sexual autonomy, and gender equality are neither new nor unique. The debates that rage today about sex work legalization, worker protection, and the relationship between individual choice and social constraint echo conversations that took place in Viking longhouses and medieval courts centuries ago. Understanding this historical continuity doesn't provide easy answers to modern dilemmas, but it does offer perspective on the enduring complexity of these issues and the importance of approaching them with humility, empathy, and respect for the dignity and agency of all people involved. The threads that weave through this 1,000-year tapestry reveal patterns that transcend any single historical period or cultural context, speaking to fundamental aspects of human nature that persist across time and circumstance. The search for meaning and purpose that drove women to seek spiritual authority through sexual service reflects the same human need for transcendence and connection that motivates people in every age and culture. The entrepreneurial creativity that enabled figures like Astrid the Trader to build international business empires demonstrates the enduring human capacity for innovation and adaptation in the face of challenging circumstances. Most profoundly, the relationships of mutual care and support that developed among women who shared the dangers and uncertainties of sex work reveal the fundamental human capacity for creating community and finding dignity even in the most difficult circumstances. The friendships described in Ragnhild the Chronicler's Diary, the mentorship relationships between experienced vulvas and younger practitioners, and the networks of mutual protection that connected sex workers across vast distances all testify to the resilience of human connection and the power of solidarity to transform even the most challenging situations into opportunities for growth and meaning. The wisdom that emerges from these ancient voices speaks not to the superiority of any particular moral or political system, but to the importance of recognizing the full humanity and complexity of people whose lives and choices we might not understand or approve. The vulvas and temple prostitutes, the slaves and entrepreneurs, the clients and protectors who populated this world were neither saints nor sinners, but human beings navigating the challenges of survival, meaning, and connection with the same mixture of wisdom and folly, courage and fear, generosity and selfishness that characterizes human experience in every age. As the soft background hum of the fan continues, the lights have dimmed to nearly nothing, and somewhere in the distance we can almost hear the whisper of ancient voices sharing their secrets across the centuries. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of history, where the most important stories are often the ones that no one wanted to preserve.